The year was 1860, and a deceptive, heavy stillness hung over the low country of South Carolina, a region where the air was as thick with unspoken history as it was with the humid scent of jasmine and salt marsh. In the heart of this landscape, 50 miles inland from the bustling, politically charged port of Charleston, lay Windsor Hall, a rice and cotton plantation that stretched across 4,000 acres of prime land. It was a place defined by its contrasts, the immaculate white columns of the main house soaring above the moss-draped live oaks, and the silent, distant rows of slave cabins, the quarters, hidden behind a copse of cypress trees. The master of Windsor Hall, Elias Hawthorne, was a man of 45 whose life had been dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the certainty of his inherited world. Elias was not a fire-eater one of the radical Southern secessionists, but a traditionalist. He believed, fundamentally, in the sacred right of a state to govern its own affairs, particularly its economic foundation. To him, the increasing clamor from the North was not about morality, but about a cruel, ignorant encroachment on his way of life and, more importantly, on his property. On a humid October afternoon, the air felt charged, not with thunder, but with a different kind of electricity. Elias sat on the piazza, a pewter julep cup resting on a small table, watching the sun dip low over the endless fields. He was contemplating the recent news from Charleston. The state legislature was moving decisively towards a convention. The election of the black Republican, Abraham Lincoln, in November would be the final, unbearable insult, the signal for action. "They will not let us simply be," Elias muttered, adjusting his cuff. His daughter, Clara Hawthorne, was 20, and unlike her father, she felt the stillness as a tightening coil. Clara was an avid reader of the Charleston papers and an eager listener to the political debates that raged in the city's drawing rooms, debates her father would often dismiss as men's business, but Clara felt the tremor beneath the surface. Her mother, who had died in childbirth 10 years prior, had been a woman of quiet, intellectual curiosity, traits Clara had inherited. She could not reconcile the grand, elegant life of Windsor Hall with the simmering tension in the quarters, or the increasingly fiery rhetoric of secession. That evening, as the supper bell rang, the quiet of Windsor Hall was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, muffled sound of a spiritual being sung by the enslaved community after their long day. Down in the quarters, in a small cabin that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, Silas worked meticulously. Silas was 35, an enslaved blacksmith of powerful build and quiet dignity, known among the community for his skill with iron and his calm demeanor. His hands, though calloused from years of toil, were capable of forging delicate hinges as easily as they sharpen plowshares. Silas, however, was not only a blacksmith. He was a leader and a visionary for his own people. He knew the whispers of war were not a threat, but a potential promise. His wife, Eliza, sat beside him, mending a cotton shirt by the dim light of a tallow candle. They spoke in hushed tones, using the subtle, coded language of the gullah that only those born to the low country understood. "The master is restless," Silas murmured, his voice low like the rumble of the nearby river. "He speaks only of the rights of states. He does not speak of the rights of men." Eliza paused her needlework, her eyes reflecting the small flame. "The mistress Clara, she passes me sometimes. She has the look of a hawk, watching the clouds. She does not look away." It was true. Clara, on her morning rides, had begun to observe the lives in the quarters with an uncomfortable scrutiny she'd never allowed herself before. She saw the careful boundaries of their existence, the resilience in their eyes, and the quiet refusal to meet her gaze directly, a subtle act of resistance that now pierced her conscience. She noticed Silas, in particular, always working, always focused, yet seemingly looking beyond the iron he hammered. The political ferment, the talk of secession, and the impending conflict felt like a storm brewing onto fronts. The white world, worried about preserving its political and economic dominance, and the black world, sensing a tremor in the earth that might crack the very foundations of their bondage. One afternoon, Clara was retrieving a book from the small study that overlooked the back fields when she overheard a conversation between her father and his neighbor, Mr. Jennings. Double quotes ... And when the time comes, Elias, your boy, young Thomas, he'll join the Palmetto Guards right with my William, Jennings boomed, his voice thick with bourbon and patriotic fervor. A fine defense of our homeland. It will all be over by Christmas, Elias chuckled, a sound that held no genuine warmth. Thomas a spirit, yes, but he's barely 18. And he's at school in Richmond. I would prefer him to finish his studies before joining the cannon fodder. Clara froze, the leather-bound book slipping slightly in her hand. Thomas, her younger brother. She hadn't truly considered the personal toll of this fine defense, the war her father treated as an unfortunate, necessary step for states' rights was, for her, suddenly becoming a deeply terrifying, personal risk. She looked out the window at the distant, silent line of trees where the slave cabins lay, and then up at the seemingly clear Carolina sky. The quiet was only an illusion. The echoes were everywhere, in the rustle of the rice stalks, in the hammering from the blacksmith shop, and in the anxious expectant silence between a father, his daughter, and the young man who was about to be summoned home to war. The storm was not coming. The air was simply holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. The deceptive stillness of the Carolina air shattered on December 20, 1860, when South Carolina formally declared its secession from the Union. For Elias Hawthorne, the news brought a strange mixture of grim satisfaction and profound anxiety. His way of life, he felt, had been defended, but the defense was now poised to become a costly, bloody affair. The state was consumed by a feverish, almost carnival-like atmosphere of patriotism. Young men, barely old enough to shave, flocked to recruitment centers in Charleston, eager to join newly formed militias with romantic names like the Palmetto Sharpshooters and the Rebel Yells. The call to arms reached Thomas Hawthorne Elias's 18-year-old son not in Richmond, where he was ostensibly studying law, but through a hastily penned letter from his father. The tone was stern, yet clear. The time for books is over. Come home, Thomas. The honor of your state and the defense of Windsor Hall require your presence. Thomas, a sensitive and somewhat reluctant scholar, felt the crushing weight of expectation. He was neither fiercely pro-slavery, passionately anti-union. He was simply a young man, terrified of disappointing his powerful father and being branded a coward, who packed his trunk with his textbooks, leaving behind a small, worn copy of Emerson's Essays, a book his father would certainly deem too Yankee, and boarded the train south. He knew he was trading his pen for a rifle, and the academic freedom of Virginia for the rigid constraints of a soldier's life. His path, defined by his lineage, had forked decisively toward the South's cause. Back at Windsor Hall, Clara watched the shift in the atmosphere with growing dread. Her father's study was now filled with maps and the smell of pipe smoke and gunpowder. He was raising a company, donating horses and supplies, and speaking grandly of the swift, glorious victory to come. Yet, Clara could not share his enthusiasm. The constant stream of news, the formation of the Confederacy, the looming confrontation over Fort Sumter, only deepened her internal conflict. One evening, unable to bear the pretense any longer, she confronted Elias in the parlor. "Father," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "is this truly necessary? Must Thomas go? Will this not lead to utter destruction?" Elias set down his glass, his eyes cold and hard. "Clara, this is not a discussion. This is the defense of everything we are. If you cannot support your brother and your state with pride, then at least have the good grace to keep your liberal nonsense to yourself. This is a man's war, and your place is to manage the home and pray for our success." The reprimand was a knife twist. Clara realized then that the fork in her own road would not be a literal departure, but an internal one. She could either remain the dutiful Southern lady, silently upholding a system she now doubted, or she could seek a path of quiet, personal resistance. This inner turmoil brought her, subtly, to the edge of the cypress grove, near the quarters. She began noticing things: a piece of cloth laid out in a specific pattern near the communal well, a subtle change in the route Silas took when returning from the distant fields. She wasn't seeking conspiracy. She was seeking truth. Meanwhile, Silas and Eliza were holding their own clandestine councils. The talk of war, the white man's war, was the most exhilarating and terrifying sound they had ever heard. To them, the North's invasion was not a threat, but a deliverer. They knew that, if the Union won, it could mean freedom. But they also knew that, in the lead-up to war, their movements would be more restricted, and Elias Hawthorne would be more suspicious and cruel than ever. "The master is giving his best mules to the fighting," Silas told Eliza one night. "He's preparing his storehouses. When the fighting begins, when the men are gone, that is when the fields will be emptiest." His words implied a plan, a desperate gamble they had been discussing for years. Their path was a treacherous one. They could stay and wait for a savior who might never arrive, or they could try to make their own escape north, using the chaos of the coming conflict as cover. The arrival of young Thomas, the new soldier, only accelerated their timetable. The news of Fort Sumter's bombardment in April 1861 brought the call to arms to a deafening pitch. Thomas, pale but determined, was given a crisp new uniform. He looked at Clara before he left, his eyes pleading for a reassurance she couldn't give. "Be safe, Thomas," she whispered, holding back tears. As Thomas rode away, joining the stream of young men, Chinggis Silas stood at the edge of the cotton field, leaning on his hoe, watching the dust trail left by the young master and the cavalcade of new Confederate soldiers. The white world had chosen its path, a fork leading to battle. Silas looked down at the earth he worked. He and Eliza had made their choice, too. Their path was not a road of honor and flags, but a narrow, muddy trail through the swamp, a path toward the North Star, a path they would have to forge with their own hands and their own courage. For the Hawthornes, the war was starting. For Silas and Eliza, the great, terrifying race for freedom was finally about to begin. The year 1862 plunged the young Confederacy into the brutal reality of war. For Thomas Hawthorne, the romantic fervor of the Palmetto Guards quickly evaporated amidst the mud and horror of the Virginia campaigns. He was now a foot soldier, a part of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and the elegant silver buttons on his uniform were often obscured by the ubiquitous dirt of the battlefields. His initiation came at the 7 days battles outside Richmond. Thomas, only 19, found himself in a frantic, terrifying charge across a sweltering open field, the air thick with the buzzing sound of mini balls and the acrid smoke of burning powder. The smell of fear was constant, an animal scent that clung to his wool uniform. He watched his neighbor, William Jennings, the same young man who had spoken so boldly on the piazza of Windsor Hall, crumple silently beside him, a sudden, meaningless void where a living man had stood moments before. The crucible of conflict melted away Thomas's inherited sense of honor and replaced it with a desperate, animalistic focus on survival. He wrote home sporadically, his letters becoming shorter, less expressive of patriotism, and more focused on the need for socks, coffee, and the constant, gnawing hunger. The war was not glorious. It was a relentless cycle of marching, fighting, and burying the dead. He saw men reduced to weeping children, and others hardened into callous ghosts. By the time his regiment fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, at Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, Thomas no longer flinched at the sight of spilled entrails. He was a survivor, but his soul was bruised and scarred, an echo of the confident young man who had left South Carolina. Meanwhile, the conflict manifested in a different, silent, but equally relentless way back at Windsor Hall. The Union Navy's Anaconda Plan had tightened its coil around the southern coast. The port of Charleston, the economic lifeblood of the Hawthorne family, was under an increasingly effective blockade. The blockade meant no imported luxury goods, no new clothes, and, most crucially for Elias Hawthorne, no ships to carry the massive bales of cotton and rice that sat rotting in the storehouses. Elias's anxiety became an oppressive cloud over the plantation, making him volatile and quick to anger. This economic collapse provided the desperate window of opportunity for Silas and Eliza. They had spent months preparing, hodding salt pork and cornmeal, gathering subtle knowledge of the swamp paths from other enslaved people, and, most importantly, waiting for the right distraction. The distraction came when Elias, in a fit of frustration over the Union blockade, pulled 2/3 of the remaining men from the fields to build a makeshift defensive earthwork on the western border of the property, a futile attempt to defend against a phantom land invasion. Silas, utilizing his skills as a blacksmith, had quietly fashioned a rudimentary set of tools: a concealed hatchet, a long hook for pulling open latches, and a sturdy leather water skin. The night of their escape was cold, moonless, and wet, a perfect night for disappearing. They moved with their young daughter, Lydia, a silent bundle wrapped in a thick shawl. They did not take the river path, which Elias would expect, but plunged into the dense, mosquito-ridden cypress swamp, heading northwest. Their bloody field was not one of bullets, but one of fear, mud, and uncertainty. Every rustle of leaves, every splash in the water, every distant bark of a dog was a potential death sentence. They were following the folklore of the Underground Railroad, trusting in the scattered, hidden network of sympathizers, a freedom gained inch by inch. Back in the main house, Clara Hawthorne was also struggling in her own silent crucible. The blockade had brought scarcity, forcing her to manage a household with dwindling resources. More profoundly, the war had given her an unwanted clarity. While treating a wounded neighbor soldier who had been brought to Windsor Hall, she saw his desperate, frightened eyes, and realized that the cause her brother was fighting for was built on the suffering of people, Silas and Eliza. Clara noticed the emptiness in the quarters the morning after the escape. Not immediately, but the absence of Silas's familiar hammer chime was a gaping silence. When Elias discovered the truth, a frantic, drunken tirade followed by a useless pursuit, he was incandescent with rage, viewing the escape just as a loss of property, but as a deep personal betrayal. Clara kept her silence, but the guilt was overwhelming. She realized that while her brother Thomas was suffering on the bloody fields of Virginia for the South's cause, Silas and Eliza were suffering equally and willingly on a muddy path to the north for a cause that was just untrue. Her loyalty to her family was irrevocably shattered, leaving her alone on the crumbling veranda of Windsor Hall, caught between the echoes of gunfire in Virginia and the silent hope trekking through the Carolina swamp. The crucible of conflict was reshaping every life it touched, forcing each to define their own survival. This is the fourth section of your historical tale, focusing on the psychological and emotional toll of the war, examining how loyalty and family bonds are tested and broken by the conflict. The war's most profound cruelties were often delivered not by cannon fire, but by the postal service. For Elias Hawthorne and Clara, the connection to Thomas existed only in the form of increasingly grim, terse letters, the paper smelling faintly of sweat, smoke, and distant battlefields. Thomas's letters, once filled with dutiful assurances, had become windows into a disintegrating mind. They were not political, they were visceral. After the siege of Petersburg, he wrote, "I cannot remember what the rain smells like when it is only washing the earth clean. Here, it only washes the blood further into the trenches. I try to hold on to the memory of Windsor Hall, but the green of the fields is overlaid with red dust. Tell father that, if he truly believes in this cause, he should pray for a swift bullet, for the slow ones hurt worse." Elias read the letters in his study, locking the door and drinking steadily. The economic pressure of the blockade, the loss of his workforce, and now the erosion of his son's spirit began to crumble his fierce, inherited loyalty to the Confederacy. He still spoke loudly of the cause when neighbors visited, but alone, he felt only the bitter price. His bond with Thomas, a bond based on shared Southern pride and tradition was breaking under the weight of his son's suffering. Elias had sent a soldier to war. He was receiving back a traumatized shell. Clara, in her isolation, found her own sense of loyalty shift completely. She started to use the slow, unreliable mail to send coded messages. When sending supplies to Thomas the scarce coffee and dried meats, she would occasionally slip in a folded page from one of the discarded northern newspapers that had been smuggled through the blockade. She knew Thomas would burn them after reading, but her intent was to remind him that an alternative world existed beyond the trenches, a world her father had deemed treasonous. Her loyalty had fundamentally transferred from the cause to the life of her brother, at any cost. This change of heart led her to a desperate, uncharacteristic action. She had been corresponding secretly with a distant, elderly cousin in Augusta, Georgia, woman known for her quiet abolitionist sympathies and her connections to the Union's clandestine intelligence network. Clara's letters to this cousin were initially about family news, but soon she began including observations about Confederate supply movements, troop morale, and the devastating impact of the blockade on the local populace. This was the ultimate break in her bond with her father and her society. She was now, undeniably, aiding the enemy. The old walls of Southern decorum and inherited allegiance had crumbled. Her whispers of home were not those of comfort, but of calculated betrayal, a choice born of desperation to see the war end and her brother return alive. Meanwhile, Silas and Eliza's journey north through the swamp country was a constant test of their bond, a loyalty forged in survival. They traveled only at night, guided by the North Star and the sparse, coded markers left by the scattered, heroic network of the Underground Railroad. Their bond was tested by exhaustion, hunger, and, most acutely, by the near-constant illness of their daughter, Lydia. Eliza, who had deep knowledge of local herbs from her years in the quarters, desperately tried to soothe the child's fever with foraged remedies. There were days when Silas wanted to stop, to rest in a barn and risk capture, simply to let Eliza sleep. "We keep moving, Silas," Eliza would whisper, her voice thin but firm. The master's men, they look behind. They don't look far enough ahead. Their loyalty was not to a flag or a state, but to the dream of Lydia's future, a bond strengthened by shared suffering. They relied completely on each other, Silas for physical protection and navigation, Eliza for quiet strength and medicinal knowledge. Their escape was the ultimate expression of a bond that transcended the brutality of their former lives. One cold night, hidden in a root cellar of a sympathetic Quaker farmer, Silas overheard the man reading a newspaper detailing the enormous Union casualties in a recent battle in the West. He felt a sharp pang of both relief and dread. The war was killing the men who had once held him captive, but it was also swallowing the lives of countless innocents, black and white. He looked at Eliza, asleep with Lydia nestled in her arms. The whispers of his true home, a home free of bondage, were growing louder with every painful mile. For the Hawthorns, the war was destroying their family bonds. For Silas and Eliza, the war was the violent engine that was finally allowing their true family to be born. This is the fifth and final section of your historical tale, focusing on the aftermath of the Civil War, the challenges of the Reconstruction era, and the internal transformation of the main characters. The news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865 did not arrive at Windsor Hall as a moment of triumph, but as a chilling confirmation of absolute, humiliating defeat. The war had not been glorious and swift. It had been prolonged, devastating, and transformative. The silence that fell over the plantation, now truly quiet, without the distant sound of muskets or the clamor of enslaved labor, was more burdensome than the noise of conflict. Elias Hawthorne was an embodiment of the defeated South. Stripped of his capital, the worthlessness of Confederate currency, his workforce, the sudden reality of emancipation, and his prestige, he retreated into a corrosive bitterness. His fierce pride had been weaponized against him. The vast acres of Windsor Hall became a ghost property, overgrown with weeds and haunted by his failure to protect his inherited world. He had survived the war, but the planter, the master, was dead. His soul was not remade. It was simply broken, burdened by an irreparable loss of identity. His only remaining duty was collecting Thomas. Elias traveled to a crowded, makeshift Union hospital camp in Petersburg, where he found his son not physically maimed, but emotionally hollowed out. Thomas returned to Windsor Hall a changed man, bearing the invisible scars of 4 years of brutality. He was silent, prone to sudden fits of trembling, and utterly dispossessed of the belief system he had fought to defend. Thomas's path to rebuilding his soul began in an unlikely way, through Clara. She had received a discreet, coded message via her cousin. The package arrived safely. It brought the end closer. Your work is done. The guilt of her secret treason was now replaced by the relief of her brother's return. She used her newfound inner steel to manage the shattered estate, not for her father, but for Thomas. She forced Elias to face the new economic reality. Land without labor was worthless. She began the long, humiliating process of applying for federal aid and negotiating with the newly established Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Clara's soul was remade by necessity. She shed the fragile, confining skin of the Southern belle and became a hard-headed pragmatist, seeing the Reconstruction era not as a political humiliation, but as a chance for a genuine beginning, a nation reborn from the ashes of the old. She taught Thomas to see the land not as a right, but as a challenge, focusing his attention on the practical work of salvage rather than the impossible dream of restoration. Meanwhile, Silas and Eliza, having completed their harrowing journey north to freedom, were living in the burgeoning community of formerly enslaved people near Philadelphia. They had reached the promised land, but they quickly learned that freedom was not a gift. It was a constant struggle. They had to secure labor, housing, and, most importantly, protect their family from the pervasive racism that existed even outside the old Confederacy. Silas did not abandon his trade. He established a small blacksmith shop, his hands working with the same skill as before, but now with a fiercer pride. His strength was no longer given to the master, but used to build his own family's foundation. Eliza, however, pushed for more. She saw the new laws, the 13th, 14th, and soon-to-be 15th Amendments, not just as legal protections, but as tools. She was determined that her daughter, Lydia, would not just be free, but educated. She enrolled Lydia in one of the new schools for African American children, and herself learned to read the newspaper headlines, becoming fiercely protective of their new, fragile political rights. Their souls were remade by self-possession. They were now agents of their own destiny, bearing the heavy, wonderful burden of choice. Their loyalty had transitioned fully to the reborn nation that, however flawed, now recognized them as human beings. Years later, in the midst of the fragile, volatile Reconstruction, Thomas Hawthorne was supervising the harvest of a small, experimental plot of cotton, the land now worked by formerly enslaved people under a sharecropping agreement, a difficult compromise. He was no longer the frightened soldier or the entitled planter. He was simply a weary farmer, a survivor. A traveling delegation from a northern charitable organization stopped at Windsor Hall. Among them was Silas. He was not a supplicant. He was a representative, sent south to advise on the formation of schools and cooperative labor agreements. The two men met not on the battlefield, but in the dusty yard of the ruined plantation. There was no hatred in their eyes, only the deep, shared recognition of men who had passed through the same fire. Thomas saw in Silas not a runaway slave, but a man of purpose. Silas saw in Thomas not the young master, but a broken man struggling to rebuild. The burden of peace was heavier than the burden of war because it demanded accountability, change, and the forging of new relationships. The nation had been reborn in blood, and Thomas and Silas, standing on the same ground that had defined their past, now had to define its future. They were no longer blue and grey, master and slave. They were two American men, remade by fire, confronting the hard truth of a difficult, shared beginning.